It was a balmy summer afternoon at Buckingham Palace, the kind of day that brought throngs of visitors to bask in the grandeur of one of Britain's most cherished landmarks. The sun bathed the palace's golden stone in a warm glow, and the iconic royal guards, resplendent in their scarlet tunics and bearskin hats, stood as silent sentinels at their posts. Among them was Guardsman James Hartley, a man in his early 30s whose steady gaze and impeccable posture embodied the discipline and honor of his role. To the tourists snapping photos and the children pointing in awe, James was part of the pageantry, a living symbol of tradition. But today, he would become the focal point of an extraordinary encounter, one that would resonate deeply with those fortunate enough to witness it. The atmosphere was vibrant yet orderly, with families weaving through the crowd, their voices mingling with the hum of excitement. Margaret Thompson, a 48-year-old schoolteacher from Manchester, stood near the palace gates, her camera dangling from her neck. She had come to London for a rare holiday, drawn by a lifelong fascination with the monarchy's pomp and ceremony. Margaret's eyes sparkled as she watched James, his stillness a stark contrast to the bustling crowd. She admired the guard's ability to remain composed under the scrutiny of countless eyes, and she hoped to capture a perfect shot to share with her students back home. Little did she know that she was about to witness a moment that would redefine her understanding of strength. From the periphery of the crowd, a figure emerged, his presence jarring against the cheerful backdrop. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with a face contorted into a scowl that seemed to radiate hostility. At his side was a muscular pit bull, its leash taut as it strained forward, its barks sharp and relentless. The man's strides were heavy, purposeful, his eyes scanning the scene with a contempt that set him apart from the carefree tourists. Margaret, ever perceptive, felt a twinge of unease. There was something unsettling about this man, as though he carried a storm within him, ready to unleash it on the unsuspecting crowd. As he approached the palace gates, the man halted directly in front of James. The air grew thick with tension, and the crowd's chatter faded to a murmur. Margaret lowered her camera, her attention riveted on the unfolding scene. The man's voice shattered the silence, loud and venomous. "Look at this bloody guard," he bellowed, his words dripping with disdain, standing there like a useless statue, protecting a crumbling empire. His tone was not merely angry, but cruel, laced with a bigotry that made Margaret recoil. She glanced at James, expecting some flicker of reaction, but the guardsman remained utterly still, his eyes fixed on a distant point, his face a mask of calm resolve. The man's outburst elicited gasps from the crowd. A few tourists stepped back, clutching their bags, while others fumbled for their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. The dog, now fully alert, bared its teeth, its barks growing fiercer, echoing off the palace walls. Margaret's heart pounded. She had read about the strict protocol of the royal guards, how they were trained to remain impassive, no matter the provocation. But this felt different, more volatile. The man's anger was not a fleeting rant. It was a deliberate challenge, an attempt to shatter the guard's composure and provoke a spectacle. James, however, was unmoved. His training had prepared him for such moments, instilling in him a discipline that went beyond physical endurance. He knew that to react would be to give the man what he craved, a crack in the facade, a moment of chaos to justify his rage. Instead, James stood taller, his shoulders squared, his breathing measured. The dog, spurred by its master's fury, lunged forward, stopping just a few feet from James. Its eyes were wild, its body tensed as if poised to attack. Margaret clutched her camera tightly, her palms clammy. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The tension was a tightrope, stretched taut between order and anarchy. The man shouted again, his voice cracking with frustration. "Go on, you coward!" do something." He gestured wildly, urging the dog to charge. The crowd was now a mix of fear and fascination, some whispering nervously, others filming the scene with trembling hands. Margaret noticed a young couple nearby, their faces pale, and an elderly man shaking his head in disapproval. A mother pulled her child closer, shielding his eyes. Yet James remained a pillar of calm. His eyes, though fixed forward, seemed to absorb everything. The dog's movements, the man's agitation, the crowd's unease. He was not just standing guard. He was commanding the moment with his stillness, an anchor in a sea of rising chaos. Then, something extraordinary happened. The dog, so ferocious moments before, hesitated. Its ears twitched, and its growls softened to a low rumble. It took a step back, glancing between its master and the unmoving guardsman. Margaret watched, astonished, as the animal's aggression seemed to falter. It was as though James's composure had pierced through the chaos, reaching even the dog's primal instincts. The man, sensing the shift, grew more frantic. "Get him, you useless mutt," he roared. But his words lacked their earlier conviction. The dog sat back on its haunches, its head tilted, as if puzzled by the guardsman's refusal to engage. Margaret felt a surge of admiration. She had expected the situation to spiral into violence, a bitten guard, a shouting match, perhaps even police intervention. Yet here was James, diffusing the crisis without a single word. His presence was like a shield, absorbing the man's anger and reflecting it back as futility. The crowd, too, began to relax. Whispers of awe replaced the earlier tension. "He's not even flinching," a woman murmured nearby. "Incredible," said another, her voice tinged with reverence. Margaret found herself nodding, her fear giving way to a quiet respect. She had taught her students about resilience, about standing up to bullies. But this was resilience in its purest form, a masterclass in self-control. The man, now red-faced and sweating, stepped closer to James, his finger jabbing the air. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat. "You're nothing but a glorified toy soldier." His words were meant to wound, to provoke, but they fell flat against James's silence. The guardsman's stillness was more powerful than any retort, a rebuke to the man's rage. The dog, now fully disengaged, lay down at its master's feet, its earlier ferocity replaced by a strange calm. Margaret could hardly believe it. James had turned the tide, not with force, but with an unshakable resolve that seemed to radiate from him, calming even the beast before him. From the corner of her eye, Margaret noticed another guard watching from a distance, his hand resting on a radio. He was poised to intervene, his presence a reminder of the system that supported James. But there was no need. James had the situation firmly under control. The man's shouts grew weaker, his voice hoarse from exertion. He paced back and forth, trying to rally his anger. But it was clear he had lost the crowd's attention. They were no longer watching him. Their eyes were on James, whose calm authority had become the focal point of the scene. Margaret felt a swell of pride, not just for James, but for the values he represented: duty, honor, and an unwavering commitment to principle. Margaret thought of her late father, a man who had served in the Navy and always preached the value of keeping one's cool under pressure. "The loudest man in the room is often the weakest," he used to say, his voice steady even in his final days. Watching James, Margaret felt her father's words come to life. The guardsman's stillness was not weakness, but strength, a strength that had silenced the man's rage and tamed his dog. She wondered what had driven the man to such fury. Was it a personal grievance, a hatred rooted in prejudice, or simply a need to feel powerful in a world that had left him behind? Whatever it was, it had met its match in James's discipline. The man made one final attempt to provoke a reaction. He leaned in close, his face inches from James's, and muttered something too low for the crowd to hear. Margaret tensed, expecting the guardsman to break, to flinch, to give the man the satisfaction he craved. But James's expression remained unchanged, his eyes steady, his posture flawless. The man stepped back, defeated. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he seemed small, insignificant against the towering presence of the guardsman. He tugged at the dog's leash, muttering under his breath, and turned to leave. The dog followed, its tail low, as though it, too, had sensed the shift in power. The crowd erupted into soft applause, a spontaneous gesture of respect that rippled through the onlookers. Margaret joined in, her hands trembling with emotion. She felt a lump in her throat, not just for James's bravery, but for the lesson he had imparted. The tourists began to disperse, their chatter filled with admiration. That was extraordinary. A man said to his wife, his voice hushed. He didn't even blink. A teenager marveled, his phone still clutched in his hand. Margaret lingered, her eyes still on James. He had not moved an inch, yet he had transformed the scene from one of potential violence to one of quiet triumph. As the man and his dog disappeared into the crowd, Margaret noticed a change in the atmosphere. The earlier tension had evaporated, replaced by a sense of calm, almost reverence. She approached a local guide, a kindly woman in her 60s with a warm smile, who was answering questions from other tourists. "How do they do it?" Margaret asked, her voice soft. "How do they stay so composed under such pressure?" The guide's eyes twinkled. "It's years of training. Love," she said. "But it's more than that. It's a sense of duty, of knowing who you are and what you stand for." That guard, he's not just protecting the palace. He's protecting what it means to be British, to stand firm, no matter what comes at you. Margaret nodded, her mind racing. She had come to London expecting to see history, to capture snapshots of a bygone era. But she had witnessed something far more profound. A living example of strength in restraint. She thought of her students back in Manchester, young minds quick to react, often with anger or defiance, to the challenges they faced. She resolved to share this story with them, to teach them that true power lies not in shouting or fighting, but in standing firm, unshaken by the storms around you. She imagined their wide eyes as she described the guardsman, the dog, the crowd, and the silence that had spoken louder than any words. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. James remained at his post, his silhouette a stark contrast against the golden light. Margaret took one last photo, not for her album, but as a reminder of what she had learned. She felt a deep gratitude for James, for his quiet heroism. He had not sought recognition, yet he had left an impact that would linger long after the day was over. She noticed other tourists lingering, too, their faces reflecting a mix of awe and respect. A young couple whispered to each other, their hands clasped tightly. An elderly man tipped his hat toward James, a silent gesture of admiration. As she walked away, Margaret overheard a conversation between two elderly men, their voices thick with pride. "That guard," one said, "he's a credit to the nation." The other nodded, his eyes glistening. "Makes you proud, doesn't it? To know there are still people who stand for something, who don't bend under pressure." Margaret smiled to herself. She felt proud, too, not just of James, but of the idea he represented in a world that often seemed chaotic, where anger and division were all too common. James had shown that there was another way, a way of strength, of dignity, of calm, that could weather any storm. The incident faded from the headlines, but it stayed with those who had been there. For Margaret, it became a touchstone, a story she would tell her students, her friends, her family. She would describe how a single man, armed with nothing but his composure, had faced down rage and emerged victorious. She would explain how the dog, once so fierce, had sensed the guardsman's resolve and backed away, its aggression no match for his calm. And she would emphasize that the true victory was not in defeating the man, but in showing everyone present that strength is not about how loud you are, but how steady you can be. Back at Buckingham Palace, James continued his duties, unaware of the ripples his actions had created. He did not know that Margaret had written about him in her journal, or that tourists were still talking about him as they boarded their coaches home. He did not know that his moment of calm had inspired a school teacher to rethink her approach to conflict, or that it had reminded an elderly couple of the values they held dear. He was simply doing his job, standing guard, protecting the palace and the ideals it stood for. His training had prepared him for the physical demands of the role, but it was his character, his unwavering commitment to duty, that had shone through that day. As night fell, the palace grounds grew quiet. The tourists had gone. The crowds had thinned, and the city settled into a gentle hum. James stood alone, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky. He was no longer the center of attention, but his presence lingered in the hearts of those who had seen him. They would carry his lesson with them, a reminder that in the face of anger, of chaos, of fear, the greatest strength is often found in stillness. For some, it was a fleeting moment, a story to share over dinner. For others, like Margaret, it was a revelation, a shift in perspective that would shape how they faced the world. Margaret, now back in Manchester, sat at her desk one evening, her journal open before her. The room was quiet, save for the soft patter of rain against the window. She wrote about James, about the man with the dog, about the crowd that had watched in awe. She described the feeling of standing in that moment, of witnessing something rare and powerful. It wasn't just about the guard, she wrote, her pen moving steadily across the page. It was about what he showed us. All that we have a choice. We can react with anger, with fear, with violence, or we can stand firm, let our presence speak, and trust that calm will prevail. James didn't just protect the palace that day. He protected an idea, a truth. That strength is not in how much you can destroy, but in how much you can endure without breaking. She paused, her eyes drifting to the photo she had taken of James, now pinned to her bulletin board. It was a simple image, just a guardsman at his post. But to her, it was so much more. It was a reminder of a moment when the world had seemed on the brink of chaos, and one man's calm had brought it back to order. She thought of her students, of the challenges they faced in a world that often rewarded noise over substance. She would tell them about James, she decided, not just as a story, but as a lesson. She would teach them that strength is not always loud, that power is not always forceful, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won by those who refuse to be moved. Margaret closed her journal and looked out her window at the quiet street below. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing, revealing a scattering of stars. The world felt a little different now, a little steadier, as though James's calm had somehow reached her, even here, miles away from London. She thought of him, still standing somewhere in the capital, his duty unbroken, and she felt a quiet pride, not just in him, but in the idea that strength, true strength, was something we could all aspire to, no matter where we stood or what storms we faced. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself returning to the memory of that afternoon at Buckingham Palace. She shared the story with her colleagues, who listened with rapt attention, and with her students, who asked questions with a curiosity that warmed her heart. Did the dog really come down? One boy asked, his eyes wide, did the man ever come back? Another wondered. Margaret answered each question patiently, but she always brought the conversation back to the lesson at the heart of the story. That strength is not about fighting back, but about standing firm, about choosing calm over chaos. She began to notice small changes in her classroom. The students who once argued loudly over minor disputes started to pause, to think before they spoke. One girl, known for her quick temper, approached Margaret after class one day. "I tried what you said," she admitted shyly. "When my brother was annoying me, I didn't yell. I just stayed calm. And it worked." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride. James's lesson, it seemed, was spreading, touching lives far beyond the palace gates. Back in London, the incident became a quiet legend among the guards. James's comrades teased him gently. calling him the dog whisperer. But there was no mistaking the respect in their voices. They knew what it took to stand as he had, to face provocation without flinching, to uphold the honor of their role in the face of hostility. James took their ribbing in stride, his humility as steadfast as his discipline. He did not see himself as a hero, only as a man doing his duty, one moment at a time, for the tourists who had been there that day. The memory of James's stand lingered like a quiet melody. They carried it home to their families, shared it over cups of tea, posted about it on social media, with hashtags like Royal Guard and Strength in Calm. Some wrote letters to the palace, expressing their admiration, though James would never see them. Others, like Margaret, found ways to weave the lesson into their lives, to let it guide them through their own moments of conflict and challenge. As the weeks turned to months, the story of the guardsman and the dog faded from public view, overshadowed by the relentless churn of news and events. But for those who had witnessed it, it remained a beacon, a reminder of what was possible when one chose calm over chaos. Margaret kept James's photo on her bulletin board, a small but constant reminder of that afternoon. She would glance at it during difficult days, when her students tested her patience or when the world seemed too loud, too angry. And she would remember, strength is not in how much you can shout, but in how steady you can stand. In the quiet of her classroom, as she prepared lessons or marked papers, Margaret often thought of James, still standing somewhere in London, his silhouette a symbol of enduring calm. She hoped he knew, somehow, the impact he had made not just on her, but on the countless others who had seen him that day. She hoped he understood that his moment of stillness had been a gift, a lesson that would ripple outward, touching lives in ways he could never imagine. And she hoped, most of all, that he carried with him the same pride she felt, a pride in knowing that true strength, the kind that changes the world, is often found in the quietest of moments.